Okay, so I'm going to do a tutorial on showing you guys some of the basic techniques to use in pen and ink shading. Okay, now an important thing to know about shading in pen and ink is that I have some drawing demos on here where I don't really use, I didn't do much preliminary drawing in pencil, but generally whenever I'm doing a serious drawing in pen and ink, I would do a preliminary drawing in pencil. Not completely, but I would definitely set up certain guidelines, to follow with my ink before I go in, especially in establishing proportions. Okay, I know that's something I didn't do in a lot of the pen and ink demos that I did, but that's what I would do. I'm also able to do a lot of the drawings and without the preliminary sketch because I've been doing drawings with ink for a long time. So it's not that I just magically, know how to do it. It's just that I've done it so much that I can sense proportion pretty well without using pencil. But I would advise, especially if you're beginning to draw with pen, you should. Okay. Now there's certain basic strokes or mark making to master before you start, going into some serious shading. For example, of course, there's the classic hatching, right? So when you're doing hatching lines, say for example, okay, let's set up a little thing here, right? And the first types of lines you can use are like, just vertical lines, just like so. All right. And then as you make this darker, you would layer this with another layer of hatching. You can, for example, go diagonally. You can use lines like these. And the length is up to you, but understand that you would create a different texture with different length by varying the length and lines you use. Okay, so if we want to make this darker, then I'd use another layer. For example, I'd go over it like so. See, so I'm using 3 different layers. I'm using first the vertical lines, then I'm using the diagonal lines going, right to left. Then I'm using the other diagonal lines going left to right, or going from upper right down to lower left, and then from upper left to lower right. And then you can use horizontal lines. All right. So you're creating 4 different layers of lines, and that gives you 4 different density in terms of how dark the area would be, and also in terms of creating just different layers of value. Now there's one important thing in addition to using these different lines. I'm going to show you there are different variables you can control. So like for example, I could use vertical lines like I did with like so, but understand that you can also just use vertical lines and create a variation in value just using just one set of hatching lines. So for example, I could make the lines pretty close like so. See that? I'm not crossing, I'm not using any cross hatching, I'm not using any other line, just one type of line. And then I can space it out, I can vary the spacing. See that? So I still created a gradation value going that way just using only one lines. And that's another thing that's important to keep in mind. So I can do the same thing with, these diagonal lines. I can make them really close and then space them out as I go across. So the point is, if you want to create, say for example, gradation and value going from one way to the other, you can do it with one type of line, like just this or this or this or this, or you can use only one, or you can use them in combination. You can use depending on the purpose that you're using and the type of texture you want to create, you can use just vertical lines with horizontal lines, and sometimes that can be enough. Or you can use vertical lines with diagonal lines, or one set of diagonal lines, or you can use it with 2 sets of diagonal lines, and that can be enough for you. Alright? Now those are the basic types of lines to use and to master before you really try to do a bunch of different stuff. Not that you have to master these, but I would advise that you get a good handle on how to use these lines. Now in addition to that, you can also, for example, if you're doing let's say a round shape. Like say for example you're drawing, let's say I'm drawing the eye or something like that, right? And I'm going to draw the iris here. Now remember also, you can also, you know, just use a solid black. So you can just shade just like you were using a pencil, and until you get, you know, a even tone of black, just like that. Or you can use cross hatching and keep hatching over and over and over until you get that density. But the thing is, you know, you'll still have specks of white in there, which gives it a little, you know, the impression that you still have some light coming from that shadow instead of using a solid black. All right. So like if I were using, say for example, this is an iris for the eye, right? I would sketch in the two areas. This is the pupil. Then I'd have say the highlight. You know, the highlight generally crosses over with the pupil and the iris, all right, the part that's outside and the black that's inside. So you would definitely know that this would be pitch black. All right. And then you could just lay the value in just to, you know, just to show the indication of the value difference between these two areas. And then you could, you see, there are two ways you could do this. You could just shade in, well, not necessarily two ways, but these are two ways you could do it. Or you can also let the lines follow the lines of the iris just like they are. See, it's almost like they're radiating from the pupil, like so. See that? And then you can grow in and start cross hatching. And another cool thing is, now whenever you're like shading a rounded form, it's important that you let the, say for example, this is I'm gonna make this a tube, right, or like a cylinder form like that, right? See, I use the vertical and horizontal and whatnot lines here. Now it's important that you also use curved lines. And I'm using curved lines, but I'm thinking in the same way like here. So even if I were, you know, I'm following the contour, you always think about the contour of this. So like whenever you're doing curved forms, two main things you think about. You always think about the light and shade, because remember you're shading this thing to make it look as if it's rounded. So these, instead of using vertical lines as in here, because if I use vertical lines, then it kind of flattens it. See? If you see the difference, here it looks rounded, here it looks flat. This isn't good, okay? It's best that you use lines that follow the contour, but I'm still following this principle as like using, you know, lines that cross hatch. So by cross hatching like this, then my next set of lines, say for example the shadow line is somewhere here, then I would just do, either I'd do lines in this direction, or I could do lines in this direction. Either way, it doesn't matter. But the point is, you're using curved lines. You don't use, because straight lines flatten curved shapes. So use curved lines with curved shapes, and straight lines with flat shapes. You know what I'm saying? See, like here, I'm using that because the iris is pretty much flat. But if I were gonna, you know, shade outside the eye, like, you know, around here, then I'd start using lines, curved lines, to, you know, to give that eyeball shape. Just like with the eyelids, I would use lines like so. See that? And then you, of course, you can vary this, as I said. You can make the lines closer together, or you can make them far apart, depending on, you know, the areas you're shading. And it's good to use all kinds of varieties to make your drawing more interesting. So don't just use, you know, straight lines all the time, or lines that are evenly spaced with the same amount of spacing. Like, vary the spacing between the lines, you know what I'm saying? And vary the types of lines that you use. It makes your drawing just more dynamic and interesting to look at. So like with this, you know, I would eventually just, this is my foundation, okay? We know that this is flat, so whether it is, see, by making that flat, I'm saying that this is a flat surface, okay? And these are curved lines that indicate the curvature of the form. Now, if I were going in to make, you know, to say darken the value, then I could use some straight lines. But see, the straight lines are following the length of the shape. Okay, these lines are very important. And another thing is as well, you have to learn how to vary the pressure. That's important. Vary the pressure of the line. So say for example, I'm going to draw a stroke of lines, and I'm going to vary the pressure going across, and you'll see the difference. See that? I vary the pressure and how hard I'm pressing down on the pen. So that also gives you a sense of varying value as well, just as I would, having lines that are close. Even if you have the lines that are close in the same way, like so, but you vary the pressure, you still get the feeling that the value is getting lighter as it goes across. So that's another thing. When you're drawing curved lines, curved shapes like this, I would make sure the lines that are straight would be lighter than the lines that are, important for showing the curvature of the form. Okay, so these lines would dominate, and these lines, would recede. Okay, and then I would just basically, this is my groundwork, and then I would just pretty much, start just layering, putting more and more layers over. All right, until it eventually. And see, also, when you have this is also very important. Say I have two cylinders here. All right. So this one is pointing that way, and this one is pointing this way. All right. Make sure the curved lines you use that dominate show the direction, or go with the direction. So the lines that would dominate on this cylinder would be these lines. See that? And the lines that would dominate on this would be these lines. See that? I wouldn't use these lines on this because it would contradict the shape. See that? And it looks confusing. See? So that means most of the lines that I'd use in this would accentuate its shape. And then after that, it's just a matter of, you just keep layering. You just keep layering until, eventually you get the degree of values that you want. See, like with the shadow, the cast shadow, I would make the line straight. See, these would be straight lines because I'm basically saying that it's on a flat surface. All right, so these lines would be straight. So that's important. It's important things to keep in mind when you're shading with pen, is to make sure the lines accentuate the shape of the form you're drawing, and to use variation in the spacing of the lines, the pressure of the lines, and the types of lines you use. And remember also, you can always play with the types of lines you use. Okay, so you don't have to use lines alone. Like for example, with this, I could eventually just use dots in the light areas, because you're very careful. You have to be very careful about the lines that you use in the light areas. So you can use lines like so, that have hooks. This is a classic way of using crosshatch lines. And you could use scribbles. Just play with it, especially when you're very concerned with creating texture. Like if I were creating, branches or leaves, I would just pretty much use, little scribbles like so. See, and that would create the texture that I need. See, and then you get the impression of trees. So that's another thing. You have to think in an abstract sense sometimes, when you're trying to create texture. So see, that gives the impression that I'm making, leaves or branches here, just by using that. So sometimes you can just use stipples. You can just use dots, and that's enough. And sometimes you can use short lines. You can use varying degrees of length of curves. See, you can use longer curves. You can use even longer curves, and even longer curves. And you can make these even, shorter. So just, it's really just from experimentation. Like you'd have to just, play with the lines you use, but think about the structure and the texture that you need. All right, you think about structure, think about texture, and think about the shape of the form. All right, your lines must, give a sense that it's following the form, okay? Because they're what's going to dictate, how the form actually looks. See that? So, hopefully those, pointers were useful.